Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of part 1 of Ngô Van's In the Crossfire Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. Part 1 is titled In the Land of the Cracked Bell, and this chapter is titled In the Central Prison. The last chapter is titled Years of Apprenticeship. The next chapter is titled From One Prison to Another. Excuse me. As though we had a silent rendezvous, every morning I was one of the prisoners who pressed their faces against the bars overlooking the small yard of the women's quarters as the female prisoners emerged two by two, carrying out the waste pails. Among them were Chi Nguyet, a tall, slim silhouette, her face a pale full moon, and her companion, the delicate-featured Chi Day. Both of them threw us quick, radiant glances, and every morning they smelled us, innocent paradis, plein de plaisirs furtifs. Innocent paradise full of furtive pleasures. Nguyen Trung Nguyet, whom we called Chi, sister and comrade, was 29 years old. Nguyen Trung Nguyet was the longest held of the female prisoners, having already been in confinement for 7 years. Nguyen Trung Nguyet was born into a family of literate peasants, breaking with tradition when Nguyen Trung Nguyet was still a teenager. Nguyen Trung Nguyet disguised herself as a boy and stowed away on a ship to Canton to join the Revolutionary Youth League, Tan Nien Kach Mang Dong Chi Hoi. Under the name of Bao Lan, Nguyen Trung Nguyet wrote in the Women's Tribune section of the League's newspaper. Nguyen Trung Nguyet's radiant charm and the freedom of Nguyen Trung Nguyet's relations with men were worrisome to the Tan Nien leadership, who issued numerous warnings against the disturbing influence of, quote, frivolous love affairs, end quote. This did not prevent several comrades from falling madly in love with Nguyen Trung Nguyet. Back in Cochin, China, Nguyen Trung Nguyet was arrested on June 7, 1929, at the age of 22 for involvement in the much-publicized Rue Barbier crime. During the night of December 8th to 9th, 1928, the leadership of the Cochin, China section of Tan Nien had passed the death sentence on a comrade named Le Van Phat. Le Van Phat's crime was Le Van Phat's love affair with the female comrade T. Nut, and his consequent inability to, quote, put aside personal considerations in order to devote himself totally to the revolution, end quote. T. Nut and his consequent inability to, quote, put aside personal... The, quote, Revolutionary Tribunal, presided over by Tan Duc Tang, the, quote, hero of the Black Sea, end quote, so named for his part in the mutiny of April 1919 on board a French warship, where Tan Duc Tang had raised the red flag. Designated 3 of the youngest Tan Nien members to be the executioners. The hidden motives behind this premeditated crime, wounded pride and/or amorous rivalry, naturally remained obscure. This Rue Barbier tragedy made me sick at heart, showing as it did how readily a party of professional revolutionaries can end up imposing authoritarian control over every aspect of life. Once the body was discovered, the French justice system entered the drama. On July 15, 1930, the Saigon court condemned the 3 young murderers to death. Tan Duc Tang, who had presided over the Tan Nien Tribunal, was sentenced to 20 years penal servitude. This dark episode in the life of the, quote, historic hero, end quote, Tan Duc Tang, who in 1969 became the successor to Ho Chi Minh as the leader of the country, has completely disappeared from the official history of the, quote, Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Pham Dang Dong, Ho Chi Minh's future prime minister, was condemned to 10 years imprisonment during the same trial. The particular role of Nguyen Trung Nguyet in this affair is not known, but Nguyen Trung Nguyet was a Tan Nien member and a relative of Tan Duc Tang's wife. She was sentenced to 8 years incarceration. Chi Day, Nguyen Thi Dai, Nguyen Trung Nguyet's companion, was 23 in 1935 when she was sentenced to 5 years in prison and 10 years of restricted residence for having produced political leaflets. And their fellow women political prisoners, Lê Thi Din, Nguyen Thi Ba, Nguyen Ngoc Tot, who were sentenced at the same time, what became of them? I remember the big May 1933 trial of those other women combatants at the heart of the anti-colonial revolts who were also tortured in the chambers of the Sûreté and condemned to harsh sentences. Were they still there, invisible somewhere behind those walls? Nguyen Thi Sao, 21 years old, who printed underground leaflets in newspaper, Nguyen Thi No, 25, and Pham Thi Loy, who had taken part in the, quote, revolutionary tribunal that condemned to death the police notables of Hu Tan, Nguyen Thi Nam, 22, who was active in the peasant demonstrations in the Cao Lan region, Tran Thi Han, originally a teacher in Vinh Long, and Tran Thi Day, both of whom got jobs at the Franco-Asian Oil Company in order to carry out revolutionary action among the women coolies. The monotony of confinement was broken twice a month by visits on the first Tuesday of every fortnight. Our close relatives, who mostly came from long distance and from the countryside, arrived in Saigon the night before and improvised a lodging as best they could so as to be at the prison early the next morning. The comrades from La Lutte helped them fill out their visit request on stamped paper to present to the office at the earliest hour and gave them food to bring to us. The guards made those who had visitors squat down along the inside of the courtyard wall, facing the head guard's office and the wire barrier. The visitors would squat on the other side, each one across from their prisoner, and put their packages on the ground in front of them. The guards rummaged through the food packages from top to bottom, fingering out our cigarettes and eavesdropping on our conversations. Head guard Agostini himself took part in the surveillance and made our visitors move off as soon as the search was complete, with no regard to the amount of time officially allotted for visits. Despite the guards, we managed to pass prison news to La Lutte. Conversely, the pieces of local newspaper that the food came wrapped in provided us with bits of news of the outside world. One evening, 2 weeks after we had been incarcerated, about 40 men appeared one by one in the yard, their faces marked more deeply than ours by longer or more severe imprisonment. They were political prisoners brought back from Polo Condor. Many of them had been sentenced the year before, militants of the ICP, Indochinese Communist Party, or simply members of the clandestine peasant unions. Our first contact with them was silent and guarded. They knew we were left oppositionists. I knew them by name from the newspaper articles I had read during the trial in June 1935. Here was Tran Van Giao, 25 years old, trained in Moscow, a, quote, professional revolutionary, end quote, as Tran Van Giao proudly described himself before the tribunal on June 24th. Tran Van Gaal's vivid, piercing eyes shined with the fierce energy of rigid adherence to his cause. Nguyen Van Dut, a tall, gaunt figure, taciturn and prickly, quote, "It's the convict labor that made me this way," end quote. He would say in his defense. Tran Van V, with his prominent red cheeks, former scribe to the Council of Notables in Vinh Kim village, had a certain arrogance, perhaps because he was an alternate member of the Central Committee. I still remember some of their faces. Chow Van Giak, who showed his prominent canine teeth when he laughed. Nguyen Hu Ta, who looked like a provincial schoolteacher. Pham Kan Kin, whose dark complexion gave rise to his nickname Andu, the Indian. Among the Pulo Condor returnees was a group of peasants from Mo Kai, Ben Tre, who, the previous year, had refused to stand up in the Court of Appeals to hear the verdict and had raised their clenched fists and shouted, "Down with French imperialism." The judge immediately added 5 years to their sentence, to which they responded by shouting once more, "Down with French imperialism." Despite the fury of the club-wielding police, the shouting continued until the prisoners were returned to the prison. As they were led back, they were surrounded by a crowd of passers-by who had rushed there to show their solidarity. Still wanting to be judged, the peasants of Duck Ho with us in cell 6, while the Polo Condor returnees were confined in cell 5. But during the hours when the outdoors were open, everyone met in the little yard, and it was there that contacts, cautious but often sincere, were established between us. They, adherents of Stalin, and we, inspired by Trotsky, tacitly agreed that we should not provoke tension between us in the territory of our mutual enemy. Tan Nien, Tan the Young, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Nien, Tan the Young, or Tun the Young, I don't know, as his friends called him, cheerful and full of laughter, humorously recounted to me his, quote, stay at the Surete prison in Ben Tre. The detainees had been put on a diet of rice cooked in salt and deprived of water. After a session when they were beaten on the soles of their feet with rattan canes, they were forced to run over the sharp stones in the commissariat yard under the burning midday sun. Tortured with thirst, Tan stopped, and despite the blows that rained on his body, drank the repugnant pond water polluted by ducks. I liked to talk with one blind old man, whose eyes were completely veiled by opaque clouds. I admired both his youthful enthusiasm and the serenity and firmness of his face. Accused of having raised a red flag one night on a coconut palm tree in his hamlet, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison plus 6 years restricted residence, then sent to Polo Condor. People called him Van Tien, the name of the hero of the popular epic poem Look Van Tien, about a young educated man who loses his sight through weeping over the death of his mother. Tran Van Giao told me about the hunger strikes and the strikes against forced labor on Polo Condor to protest the rotten food and the brutal treatment. Those strikes had suddenly appeared on March 1st, 1935. The prison guards, armed with clubs, had burst into the cells like a pack of dogs, yelling, quote, "We'll make you bastards see reason," end quote, beating them mercilessly with all their strength. The cries of, quote, "Down with imperialism," shouted in chorus, grew weaker and weaker under the violence of the blows. The guards cleaned the blood off their clubs in the basins in the yard, then resumed their savage attack on the split skulls, the lashed backs, and the broken arms and legs until the clamors of the victims died down into silence. Nguyen Van Nu, his head shaved like a young Buddhist monk, would later give me his memories of Polo Condor, written in a sort of notebook put together with pieces of brown toilet paper. On August 6, 1936, our 12 peasant companions from Duck Ho were taken to trial. Upon their return to the prison, in response to our anxious questions, all they could tell us was that they had declared in court that they had been tortured and that they had confessed whatever their torturers wanted. As witnesses, the court had simply called upon the inquisitors themselves, the administrative delegate from Duck Ho, who had had them arrested, and political police chief Gillot, who had tortured them. Moreover, the accused had no way of understanding the witnesses' statements, the prosecution's indictments, or the speech for the defense, since they were all conducted in French. Nobody translated for them, as it was none of their business. Nguyen Van Sang, a great strapping man, was sentenced to a year in prison plus 5 years restricted residence, and the 11 others to between 3 and 6 months. From the newspapers that wrapped the food our visitors brought, we soon learned that the, quote, subversive plots, end quote, in Nguyen Van Sang's case were limited to his, quote, intention, end quote, to hoist a red flag in his school on May Day, while his companion Lo allegedly distributed leaflets in the rice fields. They were all accused of holding meetings to discuss the redistribution of land and of having belonged to an association whose subscription was 1 centime per person per month. News reached us that a commission of inquiry was to be held under Colonial Minister Marius Moutet, and we wanted to make our voices heard. The Polo Condor returnees proposed that we conduct a hunger strike to demand the status of political prisoners. During the night, by short taps of a small stone on the cement floor, the strike project was communicated in Morse code to the women imprisoned in the cell underneath us. Nguyen Van Sang, the most combative of Duck Ho peasants, proclaimed firmly, quote, "Whatever happens, I will go the whole way," unquote. As for me, I couldn't help thinking of the popular saying, "Nam tat nu ku." A man dies after 7 days of starvation, a woman after 9. On Tuesday, August 11, 1936, about 8 o'clock in the morning, head guard Agostini arrived as usual, accompanied by a French guard with a revolver in his belt and the jail boy. At the end of his inspection of the cells, nothing abnormal about the ceiling, nothing unusual on the walls, just as he was about to leave us in peace, we came out with our declaration of war. Nguyen Van Dut, our delegate, diplomatically appointed in my stead because of the head guard's hostility toward me, went up to him and announced, quote, "We all demand that the government give us political prisoner status, and to back up this demand, we are refusing all food from today on," end quote. Without saying a word, Agostini gave us a pencil and paper and agreed to convey our list of demands. Those demands were application of the same political prisoner status as in France, return of all the political prisoners deported to Polo Condor, Lao Bao, Sun La, Guyana, and Ini. Improvement in food. The daily ration of European prisoners was 80 sous worth of food, while that of the Annamite prisoners was only 6 sous worth. We also asked to be allowed to receive newspapers and books and to be allotted paper, pens, and ink, and that sick prisoners not be shaved and shackled when in the hospital. As usual, at mealtimes the tubs of rice were set out in the yard by the non-political prisoners. We remained inside lying down. 3/4 of an hour later, the untouched food was taken away. No one went out into the yard during the period when the doors to the court were open. The first days of the fast I felt profoundly empty, and sweated profusely at mealtimes. The following days I felt very weak, but hunger pangs diminished, except for the day they brought us tubs of rice accompanied by eel fried in citronella with its appetizing aroma, but nobody flinched. On the 5th day, Nguyen Van Sang, without saying a word, led some of his companions to the row of rice tubs, to the silent indifference of those who remained inside. The days seemed longer to me than the nights. At the 7-day mark, I could see that none of us, even the elderly Van Tien, were on the point of rejoining our ancestors. To the oldest, and to those who looked about to faint, we gave a little sugar that we had hidden in the walls. Every morning around 8 o'clock, Agostini came and took an impassive glance at the bodies stretched out flat on the floor like sardines. Day 11. Still no reaction, and the strikers were reaching the limits of their strength. We decided to announce the end of our strike to Agostini the following day. In the morning, the guards brought us tins of condensed milk and boiled water. Our exhausted bodies immediately sprang back to life, and a certain fraternal euphoria took hold of us, even though it seemed that our strike had failed. Around midday, we doused ourselves abundantly with water in the tank used for washing, and water gushed out of the pipe in the outside wall of the Rue Filippini. That was the signal to the La Lutte comrades that we had ended our action. They had their meeting place next to the prison, and they kept watch at this time every day since August 11th, when we had begun the hunger strike. On Monday, August 30th, 1936, we went to trial. Together, we had tried to prepare a minimal response to the judges while at the same time trying to avoid making statements that could be used against us by the Stalinists. Handcuffed and escorted by armed militia, we crossed Rue La Grandière to reach the Hall of Justice, which was just across the street. Large numbers of plainclothes and uniformed policemen were posted all around. We were seated in the front rows of the benches in the courtroom. The room was packed with cops and journalists. In front of the black row of magistrates, President Judge Laval, with his emaciated mask-like face and Charlie Chaplin mustache, the public prosecutor Bouin, brawny with bloated pink face, the white-clad Annamite interpreter sat behind his little table, puffed up with self-importance. This ritualistic stage setting left me feeling strangely detached. I even allowed myself a certain measure of carelessness. The presiding judge looked over his glasses at me and grunted, quote, "What's wrong with that one? Is he ill?" A judge came up to me and discreetly urged me to uncross my legs and sit up straight. Then going up to the platform, he said something to the judge as though imploring his indulgence. Liu San Han was interrogated first. He was accused of having formed in 1935 a group called the League of Internationalist Communists for the Construction of the Fourth International, whose aim was to overthrow the government and set up a communist regime, and of having published the journal Kach Mang Tong Truk Permanent Revolution and distributed Tien Dao Vanguard, a paper printed with a French mimeomachine. And we're all charged with, quote, membership in a secret society, end quote, and with, quote, subversive activities, end quote, for having taken an active part in the wagon driver strike of December 1935. Lu San Han declared that we simply wanted to help workers and peasants gain the freedom to form unions. The prosecutor returned to the charge, quoting French translations of excerpts from our newsletters indicating that the League aimed to destroy the colonial regime by insurrection and to establish an internationalist communist regime. Then it was my turn. As a member of the League, I was accused of having organized the print shop. Asked about my activities at Decour and Cabal, I replied that I had tried in vain to organize a labor union among the coolies and work drivers. The judge pointed out that I had abandoned my job the previous year to go on a merchant ship. Then he asked, quote, "Is it your intention to overthrow the government and set up a communist regime in this country?" End quote. Quote, "We haven't thought about that yet. We're struggling to obtain democratic rights, ... end quote. From the rest of the interrogations, I sometime learned more about the occupations of my co-accused. Trinh Van Lau, who I had never seen except during our secret three-person meetings in the little Chinese eateries on Rue Paul Blanchi, was pursuing his secondary studies while giving lessons in a private school. No Chin Fen was a commerce clerk. Van Kai, the, quote, baby, end quote, of the group, was a typesetter at the Nguyen Van Qua print shop, from which Van Kai, quote, liberated metal letters and ink for our clandestine print shop. Vo Van Don, a coolie at Decour and Cabal, was wise enough to keep silent about our, quote, fraternal association, end quote, and confessed only to having sold newspapers and having put up a red banner one night on the road to Gyeongong To on the opposite bank of the Saigon River, a route that many workers and coolies took to their work in town early every morning. The banner had called for a general strike. When it was his turn in the witness box, our torturer-in-chief, Superintendent Peroche, talked about our group as though it was a fast, subversive organization with considerable influence. He concluded that to destroy our group, at least 500 people would have to be arrested. Quote, "Well, there are only 8 of them here," end quote, interrupted a lawyer. Quote, "What have you done with the other 292? Quote, "We couldn't arrest any more of them because we lacked material evidence," end quote, the cop replied. Then Prosecutor Bouin took over. He recalled how, as the previous trials, only poor peasants of Duc Hoa had been involved, whereas now the tribunal was dealing with people who were more educated and therefore more dangerous. He quoted articles from our agitational paper, Tien Dao, translated into French, emphasizing the passages in which he had denounced all nationalism and advocated the transformation of anti-imperialist war into civil war. On those grounds, he demanded heavy sentences. Trinh Din Tao and Le Van Kim, the lawyers of the defense, expressed their surprise at the prosecutor's use of the term, quote, communist virus, end quote. Considering that communists were part of the current Popular Front government in France, they argued that our demands for labor union rights should not be punishable because at that very moment throughout the country, action committees were drafting lists of demands to the government without being prosecuted, alluding to the, quote, Indo-Chinese Congress, end quote, movement that was then underway. The French defense lawyer, Loy, continued the same argument. Quote, "You see before you 8 poor wretches with no money, no resources, and no weapons. What have they done to disturb public order except to meet at the Saigon library or at Decour and Cabal or in a cheap eatery," end quote. The argument for the defense ended at nightfall. I was worried about Lu San Han because he was a repeat offender. The verdict came 15 minutes later. Lu San Han, 18 months. Ngô Văn, Chuyet, 1 year. That's Ngô Văn, this author. Trinh Van Lau and Ngo Chin Phen, 8 months. Van Kai, 6 months. Pham Van Moi, probably. And Vo Van Don, 6 months suspended sentence. Van Ba acquitted. Not as bad as we had expected. It was dark when we left the court. A group was waiting for us on the pavement outside, opposite the prison. With a surge of emotion, I recognized the slender silhouette of my mother. She looked lost in the dim streetlight so far from her village, I could only murmur some words of reassurance to her as I passed. A silver-white moon shined above the prison walls, the heavy iron door clanged shut behind us. As a delayed response to our hunger strike in September 1936, we were given a blackboard in each room instead of the paper, pen, and ink we had asked for, with which we could have put together leaflets, and allowed to receive occasional newspapers from France. This was how we eventually heard the astonishing news of the first Moscow trial of the 1917 revolutionaries. We were utterly stunned and bewildered by these abject confessions 19 years after the revolution. Zinoviev. We burned with hate against the Central Committee of the party and against Stalin. We were convinced that the leaders should at all costs be replaced by us in collaboration with Trotsky. Kamenev. The terrorist plot was organized and led by me, Zinoviev, and Trotsky. What led us to this point was our hatred for the leadership of the party in the country. Prosecutor Vyshinsky. Liars and fools, pathetic pygmies, wretched little dogs yapping at an elephant. I demand the death penalty for these mad dogs, for every last one of them. Moscow, August 19th, 1936. The 16 accused were shot. We refrained from referring to this event in our conversations with the Stalinists, but we were profoundly disturbed, troubled by thousands of unanswered questions. On December 27, 1936, I learned that Nguyen An Ninh and Tan Tu Tao had, quote, arrived. They were incarcerated in cell 7, which was cleared of all the other prisoners, but during the hours when the cell doors were open, we could meet them in the yard. On October 3rd, Nguyen Van Tao joined them. The program of the French Popular Front included sending a paramilitary commission to look into the aspirations of the colonial peoples. And Ta Tu Tao and La Lutte had therefore called for the formation of action committees and for the designation of delegates to a, quote, Indo-Chinese Congress, end quote, which was seen as the first step in forming a local popular front. A campaign for this Congress was launched and thousands upon thousands of leaflets were distributed. The action committees spread like wildfire. In the Saigon Cholon region, they were set up at the French Streetcar Company, at the cigarette factory, at the Indo-China distilleries in Bin Tay, at the Na Bay oil depots, on the railways, and in the print shops. Among the coach drivers of Tan Son Nhut, a popular ferment was building up like a sweeping tide. The colonial administration took fright and alerted Paris. On the 8th of September, Colonial Minister Moutet prohibited, quote, holding of a Congress in Saigon of many thousands of persons because of possible disturbances, end quote. A new wave of arrests followed. This is why Nguyen An Ninh, Ta Tu Tao, and Nguyen Van Tao had joined us in the central prison. With its leaders behind bars, the Indo-Chinese Congress movement was beheaded. Cochin China government Rivoal ordered the dissolution of the action committees. During the same period, the 17 peasants from Ben Luck Action Committee also joined us in prison. One second. Okay, back to reading. New section. Neither the Stalinists nor the Trotskyists sought out Nguyen An Ninh. In both sides, he was only one nationalist among many, a man of the past who represented an outdated tendency. But for me, his arrival was a great event. Perhaps I would have the opportunity to get to know the man whose battles had gripped and enlightened me for 10 years. In my eyes, he was the person who had chosen to give his combative newspaper the title of a poem by Baudelaire, Les Cloches Fêlées, or Fêlées. The person who had sown the seeds of disrespect for the colonial regime, the person who had, quote, shaken a corner of the southern sky, striking terror into the hearts of corrupt, servile sycophants as though an axe had been hurled down at them from the heavens. A description I had been thrilled to read in Van Van Hume in the central prison. One day I saw Nguyen An Ninh alone and silent, leaning against the bars. He seemed to be contemplating the tops of the teremin trees that rose above the prison walls and the cloud further off in the distance. Burning with naive curiosity, I went up to him and blurted out, quote, Brother Ninh, could you tell me about your agrarian program, end quote? He turned his head in surprise, looked at me for a few seconds without saying a word, then apparently ignoring me, he raised his eyes again toward the tamarind trees and began to sing. Something in French, and in translation is, "In my father's gardens the lilacs are in flower. All the birds of the world come there to nest. Lying beside my darling is sweet, so sweet. Lying beside my darling, that's the sweetest sleep." I no longer remember how I extricated myself from that wretched first encounter. But a few days later, a small, simple human thing brought us together and overcame the silence. Nguyen An Ninh had perhaps noticed that I was reading Malraux's Le Thème du Mépris, which had showed up in the prison soon after its publication. Reading in French was not too common. Quote, "Here, read this," unquote, he said to me, handing me Céline's Voyage au bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night, in two faded, square-shaped paperback volumes, the covers decorated with attractive woodcuts. My heart bleed with joy. He had not, after all, taken offense at my awkward questioning the other day. I took the book as a special message from the moment I read the epigraph on the first page, which says, "Our life is a journey through winter and night. We seek our passage in a sky without light." For me, it was a revelation, this speaking in everyday French to express the essentials, the poetry of the world, and all the deadly hypocrisies of the prevailing society. I drank in these words so splendidly debunked patriotism and religion. There's a passage translated in French, and it's translated as, "The religion of the flag soon replaced the cult of heaven, an old cloud that had already been deflated by the Reformation and reduced to a network of episcopal money boxes." It exploded like lightning, flashing through the monotony of prison life, a formidable howl of rage. Another passage. Quote, "I tell you, little men, life's fall guys, beaten, fleeced to the bone, sweated from time immemorial, I warn you that when the princes of this world start loving you, it means they're going to grind you up into battle sausage." End quote. In Céline's clear and brutal evocation of the life of workers, I recognized all the meaning of my own revolt. Quote, and this is a quote, and then it's like a quote within the quote. Quote, "Your studies won't do you a bit of good around here, son. You're not here to think. You're here to make the movements you're told to. We don't need imaginative types in our factory. What we need is chimpanzees, ... Let me give you a piece of advice. Never mention your intelligence again. We'll think for you, my boy," end quote. ... We ourselves became machines. Our flesh trembled in the furious din, end quote. And in the peculiar peace of the prison, I continued the voyage to the land of dreams. Quote, "Close your lovely eyes, for the hours are short, ... in the wonderful land, the beautiful land of dreams." End quote. That was my last and only meeting with Nguyen An Ninh. Nguyen An Ninh returned to prison in 1937 for 2 years and then was placed under house arrest by Mai To in 1939. Placed under house arrest at Mai To in 1939. In 1940, he was deported to Polo Condor, where he died on August 15, 1943, at the age of 43. I had first seen Ta Tu Tao at meetings during the 1933 Saigon municipal elections. I'd also listened with enthusiasm to his talks on dialectics at the Center for Mutual Education, along with a crowd of office and factory workers and high school students. I was pleased to meet him, though I knew that he had taken issue with the action of the underground league we had formed at the time of the Laval-Stalin Pact in 1935. He had referred to our league as, quote, "infantile," end quote. He was an open-faced man full of cheerful energy who refused to let imprisonment get him down. "Once I got settled," he said, "I can stay here as long as it lasts." From the beginning, we got along very well. Ta Tu Tao helped me compose a French-language letter to the judge that was both dignified and firm, requesting, for form's sake, the return of my books that had been seized by the Sûreté on the grounds that they, quote, "constituted my entire fortune," end quote. He also helped us understand certain economic issues more clearly. One morning, a discussion about the Popular Front drew together all the prisoners at the far end of the yard. In a veritable aping of Vyshinsky, the prosecutor of the Moscow trials, the Stalinist Tran Van Gyao called the Trotskyist Liu San Han a, quote, mad dog, end quote. Ta Tu Tao tried to calm things down. The Stalinists agreed that we should be allowed to speak, and my comrades asked me to speak for our group. Not an easy task. I tried to explain how the French Communist Party and making an alliance with the Radical Party and the Socialist Party on the pretext of preventing the rise of fascism had broken the revolutionary momentum of the working class after the huge wave of strikes and factory occupations. As we saw it, it was the Popular Front that was paving the way for fascism by preventing a revolutionary mobilization, the only force capable of bringing about a definitive victory. And in Indochina, as in all the other colonies, wasn't the Popular Front government carrying out the traditional policy of colonial repression? Wasn't our own situation a living proof of this? Some in the Stalinist camp seemed to agree with me, but their leader, Tran Van Gyao, defended the Popular Front, talking about, quote, conjunctures and, quote, realism. At the end of October 1936, Ta Tu Tao, Nguyen Van Tao, and Nguyen An Nin left us, being evacuated to the hospital in Cho Quan after a hunger strike. I can still see all three of them stretched out side by side on a straw mat on the cement floor in the gloom of the small cell 7. I can hear Ta Tu Tao shouting at the French doctor brought in by Agostini, quote, get the hell out of here, end quote. Sometimes, inside our four walls, with our imagination aroused by the agitation outside, we were like caged wolves. The price of a liter of rice had jumped from 40 to 70 centimes. We were delighted to learn that strikes were erupting throughout Indochina. In the rice fields, the rice planters were on strike for higher wages. The coolies in the workshops for the unemployed in Bac Liu refused to work in protest against their ill treatment. At the Michelin rubber plantations in Dao Tieng, Quang Loi, and Bin Truc, the coolies had stopped working in protest against low wages, the brutality of the overseers, the use of private prisons on the plantation, and the beating to death of escapees. At the Société des Plantations in Ben Quy, a spontaneous strike broke out, an explosion of anger provoked by the news that an escaped worker had been beaten to death. In November and December 1936, actions were begun in the woodworking shops, brickworks, sugar refineries, and soap factories. In November 1936, in the hellish coal mines of Hangai Kampha in the north, more than 20,000 miners started a strike against, quote, physical cruelty, beating with rattan canes, blackjacks, fists, and feet, end quote, and for improved wages. Similar events occurred at the Haiphong cement works. Our visitors told us excitedly that in Saigon itself, more than 1,200 workers and coolies from the arsenal had gone on strike. They were being supported by villagers in the surrounding countryside who brought them food. More than 1,000 railway workers, mechanics, drivers, train guards, and coolies from the depots in Saigon and Dian were joining in at the same time that the strike was spreading to the streetcar workers and bus drivers. In the north of Saigon, 400 coolies and workers in the sawmills in Bien Hao had stopped work and occupied their workshops. This had never been seen before in Indochina. It demonstrated the depth of the agitation and made us delirious with joy. In France, the Popular Front government of Blum and Mutet hypocritically changed one article of the labor code so that the, quote, compulsory public service work, end quote, that was unpaid in Indochina was renamed, quote, community work, end quote. The code did not provide for any labor union rights or recognition of workers' delegates. Just as before, any Indo-Chinese labor unionist could be imprisoned for membership in a secret society. On January 11, 1937, when the new Popular Front appointed Governor General Jules Brevier arrived, we began a hunger strike to obtain better food, the right to read newspapers, and the end to mistreatment in the prison infirmary and at the Cho Quan Hospital. But above all, we intended as a gesture of solidarity with the agitation outside the walls. As was reported in La Lutte of January 17, 1937, on the day of Brevier's arrival, the local governor of Cochin, China, had put hundreds of workers into preventative detention in the botanical gardens and stopped the multitudes of peasants at the outskirts of Saigon who had come to demonstrate in the city from Jiadin, Hak Mon, Tu Dao Mot, Ba Diem, Ba Queo, Ba Hom, and Cholon. Police roadblocks were everywhere. Streetcars had to turn back to the station. Buses were searched. Despite all this, in mid-afternoon, 10,000 demonstrators under banners proclaiming, quote, full amnesty, quote, democratic and union rights, end quote, and, quote, aid for the unemployed, end quote, streamed into the wharfs. When the armies appeared, bearing the governor general, the police and soldiers attacked the crowd, beating people with incredible brutality and forcing them back into the nearby streets. Everyone they arrested was taken to the Surete headquarters. There they would be tortured. Thus began the rule of the new satrap of the Popular Front. 10 days later, as strikes were spreading throughout the country, he summoned 4 comrades from the Lalut group, and tried to win them over with vague promises of reforms. The workers in 35 rice mills of Cholon greeted him with a work stoppage, demanding pay raises and implementation of social laws. The bosses gave in after 10 days of total paralysis in the mills. In a sign of the times, the Chinese coolies came out in solidarity with the Annamites. Strikes also erupted in the Indochina distilleries in Bintay. In the countryside, angry peasants destroyed rice threshing machines. Less than a week later, we ended our hunger strike in the central prison. At the beginning of February, we prepared to celebrate the new year, the year of the buffalo, which began with the new growth leaves on the teremin trees surrounding the prison. We shared between us the food, tet cakes and cigarettes that we received in abundance from our visitors. As is done by peasants who decorate their houses for tet with strips of red paper bearing calligraphed good luck sayings. Tran Van V, an old village scribe, designed and mounted 2 sentences in Chinese characters. Quote, in community we can build without relying on the outside world, end quote. Quote, with the right skills we can produce everything, end quote. The first words of these 2 phases, Kong and San, when joined together read communist. For New Year's Day we constructed a huge game of chess with pieces molded out of breadcrumbs and cardboard. The game was played in the yard between 2 teams. My friend Vo Van Don and I on one side, and 2 peasants from Ben Tre on the other. Our tactic was to confuse our opponents by discussing our game plan out loud, but in a convoluted manner. They, on the other hand, discussed their moves out of earshot. Then, following the saying in Sun Tzu's Art of War, we, quote, attacked where the adversary was not protected, suddenly when it was least expected, end quote. New section. The festivities were over. Terrible news for our group reached us of a new trial of the old, quote, old Bolsheviks in Moscow, held on January 23, 1937, a trial brought against the, quote, anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center, end quote, which was allegedly implicated in a, quote, conspiracy of sabotage, end quote, led by leaders of the transportation and coal industries. The same sort of, quote, full confessions, end quote, appeared. Pyatakov went into detail about relations between the conspirators and Trotsky and between Trotsky and the Nazis. Radek, toward the end of the trial, shouted, quote, if they do not learn from our example, the Trotskyists of France, Spain, and other countries will pay dearly, end quote. The tragedy culminated at dawn on February 1st, 1937, with 13 executions. The Trotskyist-Stalinist United Front in Lalut now seemed to us more than ever a total paradox. In Moscow, Russian Trotskyists were being treated as poisonous vipers, imprisoned, deported, or massacred. How long did the Trotskyists in Indochina escape the condemnation of Stalin and his local followers? While Tatu Tao and his comrades persisted in trying to maintain unity within Lalut, we learned in March 1937 that our comrade Ho Hu Tong, in opposition to their enforced silence, had relaunched Les Militants, quote, organ of proletarian defense in Marxist struggle, end quote, and in it published Lenin's Testament, with its warning against Stalin's brutality and deceitfulness. We were somewhat heartened by news of a strike at the Arsenal, brought to us one day, like capital A Arsenal, so Arsenal, brought to us one day in May 1937 by Tatu Tao. I should mention here that he and Nguyen Van Tao were once again back with us in prison, although both had been re-elected in previous month to the Saigon City Council. Governor Pages had no hesitation in locking them up in response to the wave of strikes. I don't know if it might have been Governor Paget, I'm not sure. Had no hesitation in locking them up in response to the new wave of worker struggles triggered by the arsenal strikes. The strikers held out for 5 weeks from April 6 to May 12, 1937, supported by their comrades in other factories and once again fed by the surrounding villagers. They succeeded in obtaining the reinstatement of hired workmates and promise of higher wages. In Na Bay, the coolies of the Franco-Asian Oil Company went on strike against the firing of one of their comrades. 1,000 coolies rebelled at the Michelin rubber plantation in Dao Tiang. In the countryside, the peasants of Con Doc and Ba Diem demonstrated against new regulations governing tobacco production. One Sunday morning, I was very moved to see that one of the new prisoners was my old friend An Jia, whom I had not seen since 1932. He had received a 1-year sentence in 1933 and been sent to forced labor in the quarries of Chao Dak, where he had led the non-political prisoners in their refusal to do forced labor and then in their subsequent hunger strike. An Jia told me that his arrest had happened during a last secret meeting organized by the Trotskyists on the evening of May 29, 1937. For the first time, delegates from some 40 factories and workshops in Saigon, Chalon, including the arsenal and the artillery workshops, the railways, the streetcars and ship repair yards, the post office, the East Asiatic Company, the rubber manufacturing company, the water and electric city company, the Portail, Ardeen, and Union printing companies, the city's 3 big garages, the Indochina distilleries, and porters in the rice fields of Hiep Shuang, Duc Hiep, Hang Tai, and Extreme Orient at Chalon, had gathered together to set up a syndicalist workers' federation, Lien Duan Tao Tuyen. In the midst of the meeting, An Gia, along with the 60-odd worker delegates present, was seized in a brutal police raid by the Sûreté. Among those imprisoned were the An Gia, where Ta Kak Triem and Nguyen Van Kim had been active in the strikes at the arsenal, and Vu Bu Bin and Nguyen Kim Laung, whose house in the north of Saigon had been the venue for the secret meeting. Vo Ti Van, Liu San Han's partner, was also incarcerated. The Trotskyists were making their presence felt in the workers' movement as never before, and the Sûreté was alarmed. Quote, the influence of revolutionary agitators sympathetic to the Fourth International has increased in Cochin, China, particularly among workers in the Saigon-Chalon region. ... The workers are supporting the Trotskyist Party more than the Indochinese Communist Party, end quote. The Stalinists did not want to go against the Popular Front policy by setting up labor unions and argued instead for the creation of, quote, fraternal societies, end quote. New section. Final section as well. When I was finally released from the central prison, it was with a sense of joy mixed with sadness for the friends I left behind. It was a sunny June morning. A prison guard escorted me to the Sûreté headquarters, where an inspector asked me what I was going to do now and warned, quote, watch your step, we'll have eyes on you, end quote. I returned to our village to see my mother. A burden having been lifted from her heart by our reunion, my mother made an offering of thanks to the guardian spirit of the village. In her distress, the human world had seemed to her entirely without recourse, since she had often turned to invisible spirits. Then I went to visit Sister Five, who lived on the outskirts of Saigon. Her husband, who suffered from asthma, worked as a stonemason. They had trouble making ends meet, but as always they welcomed me with generosity. In a poor quarter of Chalon, I met Ho Hu Tong again at his home in company with another comrade, a modest, reserved man. Ho Hu Tong introduced me to him, saying simply, quote, he's someone in the background, end quote, without revealing the identity of this, quote, third man, end quote. We shared a meager roast pigeon with our bowls of rice. This is how I first met Than Van Hoom, the man whose narrative in the central prison had so moved me. It was also the last time I ever saw him. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 4 of part 1. In the Land of the Cracked Bell, of Ngô Van's In the Crossfire, Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. The next chapter is titled From One Prison to Another, and that's chapter 5. Thanks for listening.